right, thanks everyone for coming. My name is Breitenbach. Aryana kindly invited me to come and do some philosophy with you on a Friday evening, so I'm excited to do that. I take it that all of you are interested in art and spend a big part of your lives with art, around art. Some of us make it, many of us consume art, and often we appreciate it, we evaluate it, we debate it. And I think that when we do all that, we have some sense of what the purpose of art is. So what I wanted to do this evening is to think a bit about the question of what art is for. What is it for? I want to think about three answers to that question, three different answers, and I'll go through them and raise some questions about them, think a bit about what their advantages are and perhaps problems. The first answer that I want to talk about in response to my question, what is art for, is the answer that kind of challenges the question and starts from the idea that maybe art isn't for anything beyond itself, art is for its own sake. Art is its own distinctive kind of human activity, and what makes it distinctive is that it's purpose-free. It's not for something else, it doesn't have any utilitarian purposes. So that's the first answer I want to talk about. But you might be inclined to think that that's not really all we want to say about art in response to this question. So a second answer we might give is that, in fact, art is anything but purpose-free. It has very clear purposes, moral, political, social purposes, that it should make a difference. And that's the second answer I want to consider. I think there are actually good reasons for both answers, but that they also raise some questions, some of which I'll think about. And then I want to suggest a third answer that I think doesn't get as much attention usually, which is an answer that I think is sort of distinctive in suggesting that maybe art is its own kind of human activity, even though it has moral, political, social ambitions. And the suggestion I'll make is that perhaps we should think about art as a kind of play and enabling a kind of play, but with serious implications, with serious consequences. So that's the third answer I'll talk about. So that's my plan for today. Art is for art's sake. Art is activism. It has moral, political purposes. And art is a kind of play. So the first response one might have is, it's a kind of weird question to ask. What is art for? It's a weird question to ask because perhaps art isn't for anything. It's not for anything because it's really just for art's sake. And the philosopher that this is often associated with, this idea that art is for the sake of art, or at least one of the philosophers is Immanuel Kant, who was interested in this idea that art is a kind of purpose-free realm. The aesthetic realm, including beautiful art, is the realm of what Kant called purposiveness without a purpose. So that sounds like a contradiction in terms, and some have argued that it is, but I think it makes a lot of sense if you think about these different elements of the idea. So Kant thought that beautiful art is purposive in a sense. It's purposive in the sense that it's kind of suited to our minds. When we experience art and we find it beautiful, we experience it as fitting, as in some sense making sense to us. And that is its purposiveness. It's purposive for our mental capacities. At the same time, Kant thought it's purposive, but without a purpose. It's purposive because we appreciate it as sort of fitting, as making sense on its own terms, rather than for some other purpose, because we recognize it as fulfilling a certain function for which it is purposeful. So that's the idea that Kant promoted, or the idea of a purposiveness without a purpose. That is what defines the aesthetic realm, including the realm of beautiful art. And Kant thought this idea was important because only if art is that, only if art is purposive without a purpose, does it make possible a kind of disinterested appreciation on the part of the audience. So only if we can appreciate art as fitting and suitable to our minds, but suitable in a way that doesn't depend on taking a particular interest in the artwork. Can it make possible a disinterested pleasure, which Kant thinks a pleasure has to be disinterested if it is aesthetic, because an aesthetic interest is one that we could all share, independently of our background, our education, or the interests we take in the artwork. And in that respect, art is different from, for instance, elevator design or vaccine manufacture. So you usually take an interest in elevator design when you have to go up and down in a building, but to appreciate the beauty of art, to appreciate Friedrich's Wanderer above the sea of fog, Kant thought you don't have to be interested in hiking, or you don't have to be interested in cloud formation. You can take a sort of interest and an appreciation in the artwork, independently of where you're coming from, a kind of disinterested appreciation. So Kant is a philosopher who sort of is often referred to in making sense of the idea that art is for its own sake and not for the sake of anything else. But you might sort of agree with the conclusion, even without taking on board the kind of focus that Kant puts on the pleasure and the judgment on the part of the individual or the subject who's appreciating the artwork. For Kant, it was important that beautiful art is beautiful because it is appreciated, insofar as it is sort of grounded in the response of the subject. You might agree with Kant's conclusion that art is for its own sake, even if you think that what makes art great has something to do with the properties of the artwork itself, the objective properties. And so here's another sort of approach to this idea that art is for its own sake, which you find in some of the artworks of the members of the Bloomsbury group. This is a panel by Vanessa Bell, who think of this idea as art for its own sake in very different terms from Kant. So Bell focuses in her paintings on form and on structure and on presenting and evoking emotions through formal representations rather than representing realistically or imitating what's there. And so you might think that art is not for anything else because it doesn't really sort of make a point or doesn't really represent facts or propositions that can then be used to argue for a point or to reach a particular end. And you might think that because you think that what makes art great is this the kind of emotion it evokes through formal representation. Her sister, Virginia Woolf, in some of her writings, including in the To the Lighthouse, uses this focus on structure as well, structure and kind of formal elements. She uses techniques like stream of consciousness writing, for example, to not so much represent the contents of thought, but the kind of form and structure of thought itself. So there's a similar focus in her work, not in the case of painting, but literature, on the formal side and the kind of structure that is used to evoke life or emotions through the art. And this idea that is made concrete in the work of these artists and writers is one that Clive Bell, the art critic and husband of Vanessa Bell, called significant form. So for Bell, he asked the question, well, what is it that makes art great? What is it that is shared by all objects that provoke our aesthetic emotions? And his answer is, well, it's significant form. It's lines and colors combined in a particular way, certain forms and relations of forms. That is what stirs our aesthetic emotions. And so what is implied here is that art isn't there to represent and to imitate the world. It's there to convey it's not there to convey knowledge about it. It's rather there to evoke something through its form and to sort of represent the formal structures, the formal elements of reality, and be a kind of object of formal appreciation. Bell draws this analogy with the mathematical sciences and says maybe the appreciation of art is not so different from the appreciation that the mathematician feels in feeling awe for their equation or the proof structure. It's a kind of formal appreciation. And if you put form and structure in focus, like you find in some of the Bloomsbury group members, or if you focus on disinterested pleasure and the idea of purposiveness without a purpose, as in Kant, you can then see how you might come to the conclusion that art isn't for any particular end that we might strive for, it's for its own sake. And I think that first answer has some advantages. So one is that it can account for art as its own kind of thing. Art is a distinctive kind of human activity. It's not like other things we do because it doesn't sort of reach for a particular predetermined end. And it also perhaps has the advantage that it can sort of shield itself from the political, maybe social demands of the current times. It can sort of be, in some sense, independent and autonomous from such moral, political, social values. So that's one way, at least, to draw the line between art and propaganda, you might think. Okay, so that's a first answer I wanted to look at. The question this raises is, what do we do with all that art that is clearly politically interested and clearly engaged with social questions? What do we do with Picasso and his concern for the horrors of war? What do we do with, this is an image by Käthe Kollwitz, who sort of represents the mothers suffering from their loss after the First World War. What do we do with Ai Weiwei's problematizing of the restrictions of regimes and political repression? How do we, I mean, what does all this do in art? That doesn't seem to be addressed by the kind of answer I have looked at so far. And of course, there's a lot of art like that around. What do we do with Jean-Michel Basquiat's paintings that problematize racial segregation, or Frida Kahlo's paintings about US imperialism? What do we do with whole sections of museums? I don't know, the Tate Modern's room on art and society. What do all those artworks do? Aren't they made for a purpose? Aren't they there to say something about reality and perhaps convey or ask questions at least? So isn't there a purpose to art after all? So that's the question that I think might provoke a different kind of answer, the second answer I wanted to look at. Art must make a difference, and a lot of art does, and has purposes that go beyond it, purposes that have to do with our social and political situation. Art isn't purpose-free. At least if it's good art, it should change the world. So that's the second answer I want to look at. And this answer is often associated with Marx, with Karl Marx, who I think is often evoked in arguing for the second answer. If you look at Marx, I think he's a little bit more ambiguous, perhaps, in his response or in his evaluation of what art can do. Marx actually thought it wasn't so obvious that art could fulfill this purpose, could fulfill its function of changing the world. His views on art contained a certain ambiguity about the function of art. So on the one hand, he thought that even though artistic labor is sort of situated within our economic conditions, it's at least partly what work should be. It's partly sort of fulfilling and non-alienated, partly liberated. And in that respect, it's a kind of example of what we're striving for in the class struggle. So Marx thought that art was a good example of non-alienated labor and the kind of way of what we're striving for in trying to get out of oppressive labor situations. But he thought that this kind of benefit of art is also, in a sense, its defect, in the sense that art is liberated, but therefore also removed from the struggles, from actual engagement with social conflict, and in that respect isn't directly concerned to change the world. So, so Marx's thoughts on art are this kind of ambiguous idea that art should have political import. It should be a force for good in the political struggle, but rather than actually engaging directly with the struggle, rather than getting their hands dirty, artists are only sort of removed. They just give us an example of what the aim of the struggle is. But there's a clear sense of what art should be doing, what its purpose should be. And there are others who associated themselves with Marx, who took a more optimistic line on the purpose of art. And one of my favorite is Bertolt Brecht, the poet and playwright and theater director, who thought that theater, especially theater done in the right way, could be a force to change the world, to change our political situation. In particular, he thought that theater could be educational. It could educate us politically. And how did he think, so by comparison with Marx, how did he think theater could do it? One mantra of Brecht is this idea that show that you are showing. Theater has to show that it is showing something. Theater has to show that it is representing reality and is there to teach its audience about the real world. It has to show that it is doing that instead of getting the audience sort of identify with the characters, to feel with the characters, to kind of get removed from their daily lives, the kind of idea that is, I think, insinuated by this idea of a disinterested kind of pleasure, and that Clive Bell also refers to when he talks about this idea of a formal appreciation. Bell thinks we have to sort of get removed from our daily worries, leave them at the door when you go to the theater, just focus on what you see, sort of get transported in your imagination into this different kind of world that you can appreciate without having to worry about the real world. And Marx is, Brecht is saying, no, it's the opposite. Theater should be reminding its audience that we're here concerned with the real world. We're concerned with what's out there. We're concerned to critically interrogate real situations. And Brecht thought this could be done by what he called epic theater, the kind of theater that, for example, here's Brecht's Mother Courage and Her Children, the kind of theater that reminds the audience that it is only theater, For example, by the characters stepping out of their roles and directly explaining to the audience what is happening on stage, or scenes having sort of captions to explain what is being represented, or characters sort of stepping out of their roles and breaking out into cabaret-like singing. It looks to me as if this might be the scene where Mother Courage does that, where she suddenly sort of steps out of her role and out of the narrative and sings a song that is kind of at odds with the situation and the difficulties of the real situation of the scene. So Brecht thought, if done right, art, in particular theatre, could be a force for political change. Let me look at one more thinker who put this idea even more provocatively. And this is William Edward Burker Du Bois, who argued that all art is propaganda and ever must be, despite, he says, despite the wailing of the purists. So what Du Bois is arguing is that art can be used for political purposes, and he himself did that with his writing. So, for example, in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois was concerned to, in a sense, educate white Americans about the fate of Black Americans, educate them in the sense of enhancing their understanding. So he thought that art could have these cognitive purposes, getting white Americans to understand the situation and the suffering of Black Americans, but also have moral purposes, getting them to sympathize through art, through experiencing the beauty of art, getting them to sympathize with the suffering of Black Americans. So Du Bois thought that this is possible for art if it is done well. And he makes the point that art cannot but take this role. So one worry you might have if you align art with propaganda in this way is that perhaps it, in a sense, endangers art. It endangers art because others might come along and think that if art is propaganda, certain kinds of propaganda must be censored. And this is one famous or perhaps infamous conclusion that Plato, for instance, drew. Plato thought, like Marx and Brecht and Du Bois, he thought that art has political, educational purposes. He thought that art, in particular poetry, had the function of educating, of teaching virtue. But he also thought that the kind of art that is corrupting art, for instance, of the kind that sort of draws us away from virtue, that perhaps because it engenders irrational feelings in us, that kind of art has to be banished from the state. So for Plato, that is a conclusion to draw, precisely because there's no clear separation between art and politics. So should we be worried that tying the knot too closely between art and propaganda will land us in this worry about censorship? One response we can take from Du Bois's writing is that, in a sense, we cannot avoid that danger. In a sense, there's just no way out of art taking a stance. That's because every artist is already kind of steeped in the values and the value assumptions of its society, of its time, and has to respond to it. But Du Bois's answer is that the artist can respond creatively. And by responding creatively to existing values, the artist can sort of extend the understanding of their audience and shape and change value systems, the understanding and the moral value systems. So there is an answer to the censorship worry, even though we in a sense, have to bite the bullet that, even though put somewhat provocatively, there is no clear line here between art and activism or propaganda. Here's one image of front cover of Crisis, the magazine that Du Bois edited for many years, and that was one of its functions was to promote black art, but also to had pieces on civil rights. And one of the artists promoted here is Aaron Douglas, who made the cover design. Okay, so if we think that art is ought to make a difference, if we think art ought to change the world, and that it has functions that go beyond the art itself, then we have an answer to the question what its relevance is. We can explain how it is relevant to social problems and questions of our time. But you might then ask a sort of different question, which is not the same as the sort of question about censorship, but it is a question about whether there is anything distinctive about art, or whether art is just, well, a form of activism, or is, in a sense, activism. Is there anything that is distinctive that art does that other forms of activism don't do? Or should we just accept that maybe art isn't its own kind of human activity, as maybe proponents of the first answer could more easily say? I think that is a question, and I think that the third answer goes some way towards answering that question. So let me look at the third answer to the question, what is art for? So the idea here is that art is involved in changing the world. It has purposes that go beyond itself, but it doesn't do this directly. It's a kind of more indeterminate type of activity. It's a type of play. That's the thought. And I find this idea in a number of quite different philosophers. One that I wanted to mention here is Simone de Beauvoir. So Beauvoir thought that this is an argument she makes in the Ethics of Ambiguity, that artists and writers have a different sort of responsibility than others. They have the responsibility to liberate us from the past, to liberate us from past and given values and assumptions. But for Beauvoir, this means that the artist has and the writer has the responsibility to show their audience or their reader that the present isn't determined by the past, that there is an open future that we can determine, that we can form. So that's a responsibility of the artist, and one that Beauvoir thinks the artist has a particular role to play and a particular ability to play. So Beauvoir thinks that artists express a kind of passion. She calls it passion that also grounds ethical action, and that passion is expressed in the artist's ability to show that the future isn't fixed, to show that it is open, to raise questions about the future that show that we have freedom to shape it. And Beauvoir thinks there's what the artist does is express their own freedom in doing so. The artist is able to, in sort of liberating themselves from given assumptions, given value systems, can express their own freedom. But by showing that in their art, Beauvoir thinks the artist is thereby also showing that they recognize the freedom of others, and that they recognize that we can express our freedom only together, that we are sort of interdependent. We can shape the future only together. Beauvoir thinks that is, and she talks about the mood of joy that the artist expresses in doing this playfully, in presenting and creating something, not for the sake of a predetermined end or predetermined result, but for the sake of creating. And I take this to kind of present the idea that what art does isn't tell us what to think or tell us what to do or how to think or how to do what we're supposed to do, but rather to make it possible for the audience to reflect freely on questions about the future. About our present situations, that shows the artists and the audience's freedom. So it's a kind of playful conception of what the artist does, and that expresses this indeterminacy. And I find I wanted to give you this example of a symphony of disappearing sound for the Great Salt Lake by Olafur Eliasson. Which is an installation that happened just a couple of weeks ago, where the artist presented a symphony that was put together by recorded sounds of animals, birds and mammals and amphibians and so on, that depend for their survival on the Great Salt Lake, and constructed out of these sounds a kind of symphony that could be enjoyed. I think I'll come to an end in a few minutes, that could be enjoyed by the audience. And so what I take away from this example is that what the artist does here is present us with a problem, the future of the Great Salt Lake and its survival, but also does it in a way that engages the audience, so invites the audience to come and sit and listen and appreciate and think about the future of the Great Lake and see their role in shaping it, how to treat the lake, how to perhaps organize to treat the lake differently, and so on. So I take this idea of the artist's role as sort of presenting us with social problems, but not in a way that sort of that gives us the answer, but raises questions and makes it possible for us, for the audience members, to engage with them in a creative and free way. Do
we have time for questions?
Do you want to ask a question now? Yeah, sure.
Well,
please.
I think, I understand this is sort of the history of aesthetics, but I think potentially one perspective on the valuation of art that is missing, that's very important for artists and anyone working in the field, is the valuation of art as a commodity within a system of global capitalism. Right.
Yeah.
But putting that aside and bringing this all into the contemporary frame, I think it's really interesting that, as I see it, there's been a dialectic between one and two, right? Where two has tried to displace one, to say art is meaningful, it's powerful, it has agency in the world, right? To change the world, should be politically engaged, should be involved in the social. And this view has come to a kind of hegemony. And also museums and cultural institutions have, in a certain respect, embraced this, because to a great extent, with the disappearance of the public sphere and also the spectacularization of politics in the media space, that there's been an absence of space for people to engage politically, right? And so museums and other cultural spaces have become that space where you go and you see political, social engaged art, right? Because we don't have other kinds of political spaces which make sense anymore, or aren't tainted or spectacularized, right? So there's a way in which, art became of necessity, and people will know this who have to write grants. It has to be social, socially engaged politically to have meaning and to be funded and so forth. On the other hand, what strikes me as really interesting is the return of this Kantian view of the museum and art as a space of disinterested contemplation again, because we live in this environment that's completely hypersaturated with images, with the internet. And so suddenly neuroscience is saying, look, you know what? It's actually great for your mental health to spend time meditating in front of an artwork and to enjoy these formal properties. So it's fascinating for me as a cultural theorist to see like this return of this appreciation of the artwork as and the museum as a space of disinterested contemplation, meditation, away from all of this distractedness, the depression of the geopolitical turmoil, whatever it is, right?
So you mean as a removal from the world?
Yes,
Yeah.
removed from the world. So we should go look at artworks because it's actually really good for our mental health and our neurology to spend time looking closely at the formal properties in artwork.
Yeah, I think that's right. So there is the dialectic, and you might think that we need the contemplation as well as the political framework. I take the third answer to be one that picks up on a number of these elements, although I think it does something distinctive with it. So what I find interesting about the third way of thinking about what art is for is that it hones in on the question, what does art do that is different from other forms of activism or other forms of engagement with questions of our time.
Well, and talks about the free play of the
yes, so
right? So I mean, he does.
Here it is.
Yes.
Yes, so I think this idea, and so yeah, I think it's nice that you asked about this. I think this idea that Beauvoir talks about shows that there is a kind of link between thinking about the broader political relevance of art and the focus on what is special about our engagement with art, this kind of free reflection and creative reflection that the artist is engaged in, but that the audience member also can be engaged in appreciating the artwork. Kant talks about this in terms of the free play of imagination and understanding. I also had Schiller here, who thinks that beauty is the only path to freedom, and he has a similar idea of play, though for Schiller the idea of play that is relevant has to do with our kind of volitional openness. Schiller thinks that in our engaging with art, it's not just that we kind of get to think creatively and maybe come up with new ideas and sort of broaden our cognitive horizon, but also, but more importantly, that we get to free ourselves from habituated kind of ways of acting and ways of wanting or desiring or deliberating. And Schiller sees this as not just an individual, but also a social kind of liberation. So yes, I think that's right, that there is in a way there's a return, but I'd like to think of this third answer not just as a return of the idea that art is for its own sake, but rather that it does something distinctive. It can, in doing something distinctive, be politically relevant. But there's a way of thinking of art as doing something that is more ambiguous, to use Beauvoir's terms, that leaves ambiguity, that leaves openness as to how we engage with it, and that makes the audience, puts the audience in the position of having to engage with the questions themselves and having to come to their own answers themselves. So. Yeah, I had a few more examples, but perhaps I'll leave it here. And if there are any other questions or any other comments, I think maybe we have a couple of minutes. But I'm also happy to discuss outside and later. Yeah, thank you.
Just as a note, my friend thinks that art is for tax evasion. I like to think of. I mean, it's very broad, but I like to think that one sort of piece of art is so if you look back at what kind of relevant trends, styles, history kind of related about what's happening geopolitically. So, for example, after the war, you see, I think people wearing camouflage, And so I think if we look closely enough, we can see little crumbs of like what was going on at the time. Yeah.
And so there was something I didn't hear because of the door, but did you say that it has to engage with these problems, or that it can also take a step back?
Yeah, so I'm not sure where to kind of spot it in terms of my view of three, but yeah, when we think of like people wearing, you know, it can be considered as art, and designers, you know, pick up on what's happening geopolitically, and you can see it in their work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's almost like a textbook, if you like, a history book.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's interesting. So we can learn from art also in that way, historically looking at artworks and understanding the times through those artworks. Yeah, I think that is interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
Also, to back up this idea, is more of like, is art also inseparable from the system in which it was created? And in that system, it has a certain set of meaning and symbolics, and it operates within the system. So in order even to understand what Kant was saying, we would actually need to understand his system of symbolics at the time he was writing that, and who was acquiring art, who was doing art, and what were even the premises of having art and art being created. So I think you can't really separate. Only, I mean, there might be artists that are totally going into the exploration of the medium itself. So they're very structuralist. But also, even the medium is a result of a development. So it's, again, a result of the system in which it is created.
Yeah. And understanding that requires understanding the context, you're saying. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's hard to, I mean, maybe some art is easier to understand than others from our perspective. But yeah, I think that's right, that context is important, and that maybe raises some questions about the sort of purely formal kind of appreciation that the first answer was assuming.
But I'd also love to add maybe a fourth,
Mm-hmm.
maybe a fifth.
Yeah.
There is a philosopher, Ernest Becker, telling about projects of immortality. So art and culture is a project of immortality of the human race, because we are just so confronted with the truth that we will die, but we need this illusion in terms of culture,
Right.
religion,
Yeah.
and some other stuff,
Yeah.
in order to calm us down.
Yeah, that's interesting. The last example I wanted to give you was this artwork by Agnes Deans, who of the living pyramid. There's a lot to say about it, but just one last note on this. This is meant to last. This artwork is projected until 1,000 years in the future. So part of this artwork has to do with our thinking about the future in this way and our mortality. But I'll stop there. So thanks for coming.
Looks very cute. Oh, thank you very much.